The Blackwood University Library was a crypt, its walls damp and silent, holding the smell of old books and dust that settled in your lungs like ash. The light from the desk lamps barely penetrated the gloom, casting long shadows on the shelves filled with files whose edges had yellowed with age. A student sat at his desk, his fingers sticky with sweat as he turned the pages of an old file, his eyes inflamed with fatigue, running along the lines, looking for cracks in the official version that he had believed to be true all his life. The case of his father's death, closed 15 years ago, lay before him like an open wound, and he could not look away. He remembered the day his mother, her eyes full of tears, had told him that his father had died in a robbery, a casualty of the mugger's knife. He had been too young to ask questions, and had grown up believing the story as a fairy tale told to children to protect them from the darkness. But now, sitting in the quiet of the library, he felt the tale crumbling, its fragments falling around him like dry leaves. The file was incomplete, pages torn out, lines crossed out, names erased, as if someone had tried to bury the truth under a layer of ink. The student pulled out a notebook, his hand shaking as he jotted down details. Date of death, crime scene, witness statements. But the deeper he dug, the more inconsistencies he found. The time of the robbery didn't match the pathologist's report. Evidence was missing, and the key witness, whose name had been redacted, had vanished from the case like smoke. He closed the folder, his fingers leaving marks on the dusty cover, and stood, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. He approached the archivist, an older man with a face like crumpled paper, and asked for access to more material. "This is all we have," the man said, his voice as dry as the pages he was turning. The student returned to his desk, his thoughts racing like caged animals. He couldn't believe that his father's business was just a robbery. His father, a history professor, had been a quiet but firm man whose lectures on the past had always seemed like stories of heroes to him. He remembered his father reading to him before bed, his voice soft but full of strength, and how he had promised that the truth would always win. But now he felt that truth was a lie, and his heart was tightening as if someone were tightening a noose. He opened another folder, one related to the 1990s, and his eyes fell on a name, Edward Stone, a former colleague of his father's whose name didn't appear in the official reports. He wrote it down in his notebook, his pencil scratching the paper like a knife on glass. Stone was a criminology professor, a man who knew more than he was telling. The student knew he had to find him, but fear, thin as a thread, pulled him back. He stood up, gathered the folders, and walked out of the library, his steps quick, as if he were running from shadows that followed him. Night fell upon Blackwood, its rain pattering on the rooftops like fingers scraping glass. The student sat in his room, the light from his desk lamp falling on his notebook, where Stone's name burned like a beacon in the fog. He knew this was only the beginning, and that the truth he sought might be more terrible than any lie. But he couldn't stop. His father deserved the truth, even if it destroyed everything he believed in. The rain pounded the roof of the old criminology building, its rhythm like a code the student hadn't cracked yet. He stood in front of the door, marked Edward Stone, Professor, his fingers fiddling with the strap of his backpack, a lump in his throat as if he'd swallowed a chunk of the chilly night. Inside, it was silent, except for the hum of the lamp, its light flickering on the yellowed walls like a memory that wouldn't go away. Stone sat at the table, his figure carved from old oak, stooped but strong, his hands stained with age. His Eyes hidden behind thick glasses regarded the student with a weary wariness. On the table lay a pack of cigarettes, long past their sell-by date, and an ashtray full of butts, evidence of nights spent alone with the ghosts of the past. "Thank you for meeting," the student began, his voice muffled more than he intended, as if the walls were soaking up the sound. Stone nodded, his fingers tapping the tabletop as if beating out a forgotten melody. "I don't often talk about those years," he said, his voice rough as the wind in an empty alley. "But you're your father's son. That means something." The student sat up, his backpack falling to the floor with a soft thud. "You worked with him in the 90s, he said, his words as careful as steps on thin ice. "What did he do? Why did his name disappear from all the records?" Stone took off his glasses, wiped them with the hem of his sweater, his movements slow, as if he were stalling for time. "He was an explorer," he finally answered, his gaze sliding to the window, where the rain was making patterns on the glass. "But not the kind who sits in a library. He dug where others feared to tread." The student's heart began to beat faster, his fingers tightening on the arms of his chair. "You mean crimes?" he asked, his voice sharp, like a knife testing the strength of fabric. "Was he involved in something?" Stone chuckled, but there was no joy in the sound, only a bitterness as old as the embers of a long, cold fireplace. "Involved is a strong word," he said. "Let's just say he knew people who didn't like being found out." The student leaned forward, his eyes like lanterns in the fog. "What people?" he asked, his voice shaking with anticipation. "Can you give me anything?" Stone leaned back, his fingers closing around the ashtray as if it might shield him from the words. "There were those who called themselves guardians of the order," he said, his tone as cold as the wind outside. "But their order was written in blood. Your father, he saw it, and he couldn't turn away." Silence hung in the room, heavy as a wet cloak. The student felt the questions threatening to come out, but Stone held up a hand to stop him. "Ask no more," he said, his voice hard as steel. "There are some things best left in the past, for your own good." But the student did not back down, his gaze a challenge. "And if I don't want to?" he asked quietly. "What if I must know?" Stone looked at him, and there was a flicker of regret in his eyes, not fear. "Then you will find what he hid," he said, "but don't expect to like it. Later, at home." The student stood in the living room, surrounded by silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards underfoot. He opened his father's old trunk, its lid creaking in protest, releasing the smell of mildew and forgotten years. Inside were letters tied with string, their edges yellowed like bones long since stripped of flesh. He unfolded one, his hands shaking like a compass needle seeking north. His father's handwriting was uneven, hurried. "If I do not return, destroy this. They must not know." The student froze, his breathing ragged, as if the air had grown too thick. He found a locket, small, engraved with the initials KP, which he did not recognize. Inside was a photograph, his father and two others, their faces blurred by time, but their smiles seemed forced, like masks. Something jingled under the chest. A key, old and stained with rust, fell to the floor. The student picked it up. His fingers felt the cold metal, and he realized that this key did not open a door, but a secret he was not yet ready to accept. Outside the window, the wind howled like a beast, and the student felt the darkness stone had spoken of move closer. He knew there was no turning back, and that every discovery was a step toward the abyss his father had tried to skirt. But now it was his abyss, and he had to descend into it. The fog outside the mansion's gates had thickened, turning into an impenetrable curtain through which the outlines of trees were barely visible. The student walked quickly, but every sound, the crunch of a branch underfoot, the distant creak of shutters, made him look back. He felt a gaze, heavy as lead, but he could not see its source. Jacob Reed's words still rang in his head, sharp as shards of glass. "You will find what he hid." Something in that tone suggested that Reed was not threatening, but predicting, and that was even more frightening. He turned off the path, taking cover behind an old oak tree, its rough bark cold against his palms. He took a notebook from his pocket and wrote down fragments. KP, influence, father. The ink was running from the dampness, but he kept writing, as if the words could keep him from falling into the abyss he was falling into. The smell of incense still clung to his clothes, mingling with the damp scent of the earth, and the combination seemed to him a signal that he had crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. In the distance, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. As someone left the mansion, the student pressed himself against a tree, his breath catching, his heart pounding like a trapped animal. The car stopped, the headlights flickering into the fog, and he saw a figure, tall in a long coat, walking with confidence. It was not Reed, but something about the figure seemed familiar, like a shadow from an old dream. The door slammed, the engine roared, and the car was gone, leaving only an echo in its wake. He returned to his notes, his fingers shaking, but he forced himself to concentrate. The KP symbol from the album was a clue, but to what? The club? Control? Or something personal, connected to his father? He remembered the portraits in the hall, stern faces frozen in oil paint, and the masks hanging nearby, white and empty, like shells of souls. Perhaps this was not just decoration, but a hint. He wrote, masks, roles, club members hiding themselves. Silence of the forest was broken by the snapping of branches, close, too close. He put the notebook away and held his breath. The footsteps were approaching, slow but careless, as if someone was searching but unsure of the direction. The light of the lantern flickered in the fog, picking out clumps of bark and leaves, and a voice, low, hoarse, said, "He can't have gone far." The student cringed, his body turned to stone, and his mind screamed, "They know." The lantern passed. A meter from him, the beam slid along the ground but did not touch him. The footsteps moved away, dissolving in the noise of the wind. He waited until the silence was absolute before he allowed himself to exhale. His coat was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, but he didn't feel the cold, only the heat that burned inside, fueled by fear and determination. Reed had given him a clue, but it was a trap, and he knew it. To leave now would be to lose everything he had found. The connection to his father, the secret of the club, the truth that hid behind words and looks. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees, and looked at the mansion, whose windows now seemed like eyes watching him from afar. Tension squeezed his chest, but he took a step forward, not back toward the city, but toward the old chapel visible through the trees. There, in the ruins, might be answers, or the end. He didn't know, but he couldn't stop. The student stood in the living room of the old family home, his breath mingling with the rain outside, the light from the desk lamp falling on the stack of papers he had laid out on the table like cards in a game of chance, where his soul was at stake. The files, covered in his father's handwriting, lay open, their pages covered with numbers, names, dates, a web he was trying to unravel. But with each knot, he found himself entangled further. He ran his finger along the line where the name Edward Stone was repeated, like the refrain of a song he did not want to hear. Beside him lay a medallion engraved with KP, its surface as cold as the truth he was afraid to accept. The mother sat in an armchair by the fire, her lined face pale as a sheet, her hands clutching her teacup, shaking like leaves in the wind. She was silent, her tired eyes looking at her son but not seeing him. They saw the past she was trying to bury. The student came up to her, his steps as soft as a whisper, and knelt down, his hands on hers, cold and hard as stone. "Mother," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words were caught in his throat. "I found it. The letters, the notes. What was he doing? Who were these KPs? Why was he silent?" The mother looked up, her lips twitching as if she were about to smile, but instead the tears trickled down her cheeks, leaving shiny tracks like snail tracks. "He didn't want you to know," she whispered, her voice weak as the wind in an empty house. "He loved you more than anything, but there were things he couldn't change." The student squeezed her hands tighter, his nails digging into her skin, but he felt no pain. "What things?" he asked, his words like blows, but there was a plea in them. "He was a professor. He taught me the truth. What was he hiding? The..." Mother closed her eyes, her lids fluttering like a moth's wings, and when she opened them, there was an emptiness in her gaze, like someone who had lost everything. "He was part of a club," she said, her voice hard as steel, but there was a crack in it. "They called themselves the Guardians of the Peace, but it was a lie. They took money, framed people, covered up crimes. Your father, he couldn't leave. They wouldn't let him." The student recoiled, his face white as paper, a fire in his chest. Not of rage, but of despair, burning him from the inside. He stood, his legs shaking, but he walked to the table, his fingers shuffling through the papers as if they might give him an answer he didn't want to hear. "Was he a criminal?" he asked, his voice quiet, like a whisper from beyond the grave. "Did he kill, extort?" The mother shook her head, her tears falling to the floor like rain outside. "He didn't kill," she said, her words like a knife piercing a heart. "But he kept quiet. He knew, and he kept quiet. And when he tried to leave, they didn't forgive." The student slumped in his chair, his hands clutching his head as if he were trying to keep his mind from disintegrating. The memories came flooding back, his father reading to him, his voice so strong, his eyes so loving. But now he saw something else. The shadows that hid behind those eyes, the secrets he kept like poison hidden in wine. He pulled out the audio cassette he had found in the chest, his fingers shaking as he inserted it into the old tape recorder. His father's voice came out, weak and broken. "If something happens to me, I deserve it." The words were like a blow, and the student felt his heart stop, as if time had frozen. The mother stood up, her steps unsteady, like someone walking on the edge of a precipice. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her fingers cold as ice. "He wanted to protect you," she said, her voice as low as a whisper. "He didn't want you to know. But now Now you have to decide what to do with this truth. The student looked at her, his eyes full of tears, but he did not cry. He knew that the truth he had found was not salvation but a sentence, and that the father he loved was not a hero, but a man mired in sin. He stood, his steps hard as steel, and walked to the window, his fingers brushing the cold glass. The rain was pouring outside, dripping down the glass like tears he had no more. He knew he had to tell the truth, even if it destroyed everything he believed in. His father deserved the truth, even if it was bitter as poison. He turned to his mother, his voice quiet but firm. "I have to do this," she nodded, her face a mask of pain, but there was a pride in her eyes as old as time. "Then go," she said, her words like a farewell. "Go and do what you must." He walked out of the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence, the rain lashing his face. He knew there was no turning back, and that the truth he carried was like a fire that would burn everything in its path. But he couldn't stop. His father deserved the truth, even if it was worse than any lie. The university hall was cold. Its marble walls reflected the light of the chandeliers like mirrors, but there was no warmth in their reflection, only emptiness, like the eyes of the people gathered here. A student stood at the podium, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium. His voice, when he began to speak, was quiet but hard, like steel forged in fire. In front of him sat professors, deans, committee members, their faces masks hiding their thoughts, but he felt their gazes sharp as knives, ready to cut his words to pieces. "My father, Professor James Harris, was not killed in a robbery," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones into a well. "He was part of a club that called itself the Guardians of the Peace, but theirs was a peace built on lies, extortion, and murder." The room went silent, the air thick as fog, and he saw the professors' faces tighten, their lips pressed, together as if they were trying to hold the truth inside. He pulled out a folder, his hands shaking, but he opened it, and the document scattered across the table like dry leaves. "Here is the evidence," he said, his voice rising like thunder before a storm. "Payments, signatures, records. My father was not a victim, but an accomplice. He kept quiet until he tried to get out, and for that he was eliminated." He watched as the dean, a gray-haired man with a face like crumpled paper, stood up, his hands shaking like leaves in the wind. "This is slander," he said, his voice hoarse like the sound of tearing cloth. "You cannot accuse respectable people without evidence." The student looked at him, his eyes burning like coals. "The evidence is here," he said, his words like hammer blows, "and I will not stop until the truth comes out." The commission launched an investigation. Its sessions were closed like coffins, but the student knew that the truth, like water, would find a crack through which to leak. He left the hall, his steps echoing loudly in the empty corridor, and outside the window the rain poured like tears, of which he had no more. His mother did not come to the meeting. Her silence was like a sentence, and he knew that she would not forgive him. But he could not live with a lie, even if the truth was poison. That night he stood outside in the rain, his coat soaked, but he didn't feel the cold, only the emptiness that was eating away at him from the inside. He pulled out his father's last recording, the cassette he'd found in the trunk, and lit it with a lighter, its flame weak but as strong as his resolve. Ashes fell onto the wet pavement, mixing with the dirt, and he knew it was the end, not just for his father, but for himself. His future was as murky as the fog that shrouded Blackwood. But he was free of illusions, and that was his only victory. He walked into the night, his shadow cast across the pavement, long and crooked, like a scar that would never heal. Behind him, the club lived on, its tendrils reaching out to the city. But he had made his choice, and this was all he had left. The rain pounded the rooftops, its rhythm as eternal as time, and the student disappeared into the fog, a ghost that would never find rest.